So, first off, welcome. And hold on, let me turn this up a little bit so I can see us balance here. Our friends are joining back in. Give them a few moments. So everyone,
Mhm.
just take your time in here. And Mo, it's great to see you. And I was telling the audience that 16 years ago we had a conversation about integrity. Ultimately, that's really what the conversation was about, which was the integrity you showed with Admiral Haynes when he was going to go for there will be no acquittals. And
Yeah.
you know, let's start a little bit from that era about the lessons that we should have learned in the Bush administration that I think brought us to where we're at now.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Looking back, I think we thought those were like the worst of times. And of course, by comparison, those were probably pretty decent times. But, you know, as Americans, we spent decades, respecting the rule of law. And if you look at things like the Geneva Conventions, the Convention Against Torture, the International Criminal Court, we led the effort to establish all of those things. And then it seemed like after 9/11 that we got scared and all those
Right.
principles that we expected others to abide by, we found them inconvenient. We didn't. And certainly, uh, well, as you know, like Guantanamo, for example, was chosen because the Bush administration thought it was a law free zone that the law couldn't touch. And, what's really shocking to me was, I resigned as chief prosecutor at Guantanamo, uh, God, back in 2007.
Hmm.
So 19 years ago, and Guantanamo is still an ongoing issue. And I
And
thought,
now we're using it for immigration.
yeah, you would have thought we'd be talking about Guantanamo in the past tense a long time ago,
Right.
but it's still ongoing. But I think, the things that we like with torture, we came up with like new terms, enhanced interrogation techniques to try to mask what we were doing, what every rational human being would call torture. But, again, the things that we for decades had upheld when it was inconvenient, we just jettisoned. And we,
Right.
we became no better than a lot of the other countries that historically we've condemned for their behavior is what we did.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I remember sadly back then was that we had um, we had the conversation about I talked to Colonel Morris David to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson back then, and he said there's no appetite for accountability in D.C. And I remember Nancy Pelosi, and we're going to talk about the Democratic Party tonight. I remember Nancy Pelosi saying she wanted a 20-year reign of Democrats right after she ran in 2006 on accountability. So the Democratic Party has had a habit of asking for people like me, an independent from Texas, to believe in us because we're not them. But they don't do anything once given power, and it comes back to bite them. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, in hindsight, I think President Obama did a lot of good things, but he did a lot of things that I wish he'd, taken a different tact on.
Mhm.
And one of those, you'll recall early on in his administration, I mean, people have to remember back, when he took office, we were, in the Great Recession. So
Right.
getting the economy restored was, priority one. Healthcare, the Affordable Care Act was like his top legislative initiative.
Hmm.
And I think Guantanamo and all those kind of issues just weren't cracking the top 10 list.
Hmm.
And, early on, he said, we're going to look forward and not back.
Right.
And you can understand the rationale for that, if you've got an agenda of things you want to do, don't spend your political capital, litigating what happened in the past if you're trying to work on the future. But I think, the problem with that, and maybe it began back with, Ford pardoning Nixon, but it certainly has perpetuated this notion that, those at the top, there is no accountability. And
Right.
I think part of what we're living in today is a result of those years and years of the notion that, the president can do whatever the hell he wants and, there's no accountability for it. So in hindsight, I think had Obama taken a different tact and, there was accountability for the things that we did, after 9/11, then perhaps we wouldn't be in the state we're in today.
And so I'll move us really quickly forward to Jan 6 and post Jan 6 era, where we have a major violation of all ethics norms and basically crimes against the democracy itself. And it was a slow drag through all of the process for 4 years of holding not just Trump accountable, but all of the people around him.
Right. Yeah.
So you're a judge. So give me perspective. Set me straight because you're a judge. What do I misunderstand maybe about that process? Because I'm just a layman.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And again, if you compare, I mean, you've seen the lightning speed with which the Trump Justice Department and the judicial system has been able to move. And if you go back to the Biden administration, we're moving at the speed of, molasses on a cold morning.
Right.
And I think, that was a mistake. I kind of feel, bad for, all the folks who invested their time and effort into trying to have accountability. And that slow drip just enabled the clock to run out. And,
right.
I think, one of the big reasons Trump ran was to, stay out of prison. And
that is the only thing I think he ran for. I think that's the only priority. He hasn't disproven me on that once. I mean, making money, yeah, but when you're almost 80 years old and you're just trying to stay out of prison, some money's great, but stay out of prison is really the objective. Throw everything into wax at the machines.
Yeah. So, I was really happy at the time that, Merrick Garland, I think, really got screwed over on the Supreme Court thing.
Absolutely.
So I was kind of happy, when Biden appointed him attorney general, thought it was kind of some vindication for what had happened to him.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, what a waste of 4 years. And again, I think, we're living the consequences of that, that had there been some real accountability, then we wouldn't be where we are today.
Considering where we are today, and we have 1 year in with the craziest people you can imagine getting any role. I mean, Patel in front of the FBI, Tulsi Gabbard. Everyone knows I will rant about Tulsi Gabbard way too long. DNI, John Radcliffe, even at the CIA, all these people who were political hatchet guys and ladies. Pam Bondi being a complete travesty at the DOJ. It does show that the clown car is one. It's in charge, but it's not a how do I always say it's not a defect. It's the design.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump, to his credit, I guess if you want to phrase it that way, learned a lesson from his first term because he did. He had some people around him that kind of put some guardrails in place and didn't let him just do whatever the hell he wanted to do. And I think he learned that on the second go round, it was loyalty was the only criteria. And so you see people appointed to posts that they have absolutely no qualifications for. And they're taking them with the sole purpose of carrying out Trump's agenda. I mean, it's always appeared to me that whatever you see the Republicans accusing the Democrats of doing is exactly what the Republicans are doing.
Exactly.
And say this like, they bitched and whined about weaponizing the Justice Department. Well, they truly have. This is, it's no longer about justice. It's about retribution and, stifling dissent and carrying out, Trump's, vengeance. And it's really sad. I mean, I've been a member of the Supreme Court bar for, over 30 years, and I used to be really proud of that. And it's disappointing that, at the district court level, a lot of the judges are stepping up and doing the right thing. But the Supreme Court, John Roberts has proven to be a real disappointment. I thought he was, concerned about the legacy of the Roberts Court, but it seems like he just doesn't give a damn. And it's enabled Trump to become a dictator.
If in effect he is a dictator, because if the Congress shows no will to hold him accountable, and we know the Supreme Court is basically broken. And potentially with these Epstein logs coming out, there's a lot of material about people in those positions that means they're going to work overnight to cover each other. It becomes, in effect, a dictatorship. What do you think our viewers need to start thinking about, even just beyond midterms? So midterms are a big deal, so we'll definitely talk about that. But what else do they need to be thinking about, perhaps, in this process to get through this chaos storm?
Well, like you said, I think the midterms are a vital first step. If we screw that up, then we're hosed. But if we can get past that, I mean, again, I think Democrats need to have a different philosophy. I think this, when they go low, we go high crap. I think a lot of folks are learning is it was a huge mistake.
Right.
And again, if you look at the lightning speed at which, we're only a year into the Trump administration.
Right.
And if you look at the carnage they've been able to carry out in a year's time and compare that with the Biden administration and that slow, methodical, everything by the book, and, we don't want to rock the boat. I mean, I don't think the Republicans, there's that talk about adding more justices to the Supreme Court. We should have done that.
Right.
Yeah, people would have bitched and complained about it, but I guarantee the other side would have no qualms about, they'll set aside any norm when it's an impediment to them. And so we need to be thinking, first, let's put the brakes on at the midterms, but when we win in 2028, let's go pedal to the metal to start fixing. I mean, it's going to take generations to repair the damage that we've done in a very short period of time. So I'd say, screw it. Let's put our foot down and start getting us back to where this country ought to be.
At some point, I want to get to the fact that you're from North Carolina, and Asheville is such a beautiful area. I miss it. I love whenever I catch your videos. Last time I was there was a fight to keep a Walmart out of town. So that's been a while. Is there a Walmart there now?
Oh, there's a Walmart. Yeah, the big news today was everybody was excited that Costco was coming. And today Costco announced they're pulling the plug on it. So a lot of folks were bummed out here in Asheville.
But as a military guy and a judge, I sometimes don't know how to explain to people to be both ruthless like your enemy, but within a certain ethic. And my model is usually like someone like Musashi, who had, the Book of Five Rings. But this is in a whole era, and I live in a war, a tangible, 1,410 days of active war. So I know that my compass is radically different than what's happening in America. But I think there's something about ruthlessness versus illegal behavior. Like, I'm not asking for illegal behavior, but to get past this, like you said, they go low, we go high aspect to say, no, we meet them pound for pound and plus one.
Yeah. You can be firm and still be fair. I just think for two, I mean, I ran for Congress back in 2020, and they used to joke back then that, the Republicans come to a knife fight armed with a, AR-15, and Democrats show up with a quinoa salad and want to, hold hands and sing Kumbaya and be nice. I mean, you can be firm and still be fair to people. But I think for too long, we've wanted to have, be the Kumbaya party. And, the other side's just pummeled us. And
that's correct.
And I think some folks are beginning to, to get the message that, that we've got to be more aggressive. And I think that's the reason a lot of voters, have turned away from the Democratic Party, that they just see it as being, I don't know if you remember, there was, after the November elections, there was some polling, and they asked Democrats, what word best describes your party? And the number one word was weak.
Correct.
So I think that's the corrective. The Democrats, I'm really pleased to see there's some folks like, I really love Gavin Newsom.
That's what I mean by being ruthless.
Yeah. And I love
being ruthless.
I'm always amused when the MAGA crowd gets upset at him for being rude when he's doing exactly verbatim what Donald Trump is doing. So
Right.
giving it back to him, fighting back. We got to do it. We can't. You know, we're coming up on our 250th anniversary, and I hope it's not our last. So we got to fight for it.
I might give our viewers a little perspective because in the background you can't hear it, but our air raid is kicked in. And the reason why it's filling quickly is, and you'll watch it. I'll leave it up here while it does this. This is ballistic warning. This isn't slow drone swamp. This is essentially what we live with. And why do I say that this is a good relationship between what we have in America? Is you don't have that. You don't have these things flying at you. And yet I watch Ukrainian soldiers when they capture Russians. They don't torture them. They don't beat them. I'm not saying someone doesn't get smacked in the head. It's war. I would be surprised if that doesn't happen. But they have a very high bar of what they do, and I have friends that have done that capture work to injured Russians, and they basically heal them up, and they feed them, and they basically say, "We're not you." That's why. And that's what I mean by both ruthless, meaning if they have to kill them on the battlefield, they'll kill them on the battlefield. But if they don't kill them on the battlefield, they're going to do all that other stuff that the Russians could never do. And it's not a kumbaya game.
Yeah.
And it's hard, tangible war. And then I look in America, and there's a cognitive warfare problem people are not relating to. They're being inundated with tons of information that they don't know what to do with. Tons of information about Epstein, tons of information about the attack on the media, and there's not a tangible action to deal with it. So I'm thinking that guys like Graham Plattner and some of these other voices that are rising into the party are part of that answer, at least in the political sphere, and some of the no kings behavior that's taking place. But I tell people, if you're waiting for that next scheduled rally, you're fucked.
Yeah.
Pardon the French, but if your next rally is in March,
Yeah.
what you got
Yeah.
to take action.
No, I agree. And I think, you're exactly right. I mean, going back to Guantanamo again, I guarantee you 99 out of 100 people, if you walked out on the streets here in Asheville,
Hmm.
are oblivious.
Hmm.
They'd be shocked that to hear that it's still open because it's just out of sight and out of mind.
Hmm.
Kind of like what's going on in Ukraine. I think a lot of folks here have that's fallen off the radar because
Right.
like you said, there is so much. Trump's just flooded the zone and occupied you know, the airspace.
Hmm.
And of course, the right now, they literally control social media. They own it.
Right.
And what they don't own of mainstream media, they've, kowtowed.
Hmm.
So what people are hearing, uh, there's only so much you can. And I know a lot of folks who just said, "Screw it, I've quit watching the news.
Right.
I'm just overwhelmed, and there's nothing I can do about it." And that's exactly, what Trump and MAGA want.
Well,
Yeah.
and as a man who spent your time doing being a judge, you know the power of upholding the law, of the institutions having merit and credibility. So now we're obviously people are confused about what to do with it, but they have to get these institutions back
Yeah.
at the state level, especially. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at all levels. I mean, there's this.
Right. Right.
I mean, and again, the other side is perpetuated the distrust in government,
Hmm.
um, and we've got to restore, you know, faith in this notion of the deep state. I always thought, I mean, if you've worked in government, the government's not smart enough to pull off half the crap they're accused of doing.
Right. Right.
But we've got to restore. I mean, everybody. There are bad people in government, and they should be out. But my experience has been 98% of the people that are in government. Let's like today, I had an appointment. There's a VA hospital about a mile from where I live. We're really fortunate here in Asheville. There are 155 VA medical centers around the country, and ours here is ranked number 2. And people love it. And so it really bothers me to see government employees vilified. They're lazy, they're corrupt, they're whatever. I was at the VA today, and the folks there, couldn't be more professional.
Right.
So, it's easy, in particular in some of the rural counties around here, to have this distrust of government, but it's that concept of government. I mean, they like their postman, they like the forest ranger. It's that unknown that they don't like, and we've got to work on rebuilding trust in government. And I think certainly, I've had a number of folks ask, how did we get in the state that we're in? And there are myriad reasons. I think there are two big ones. I think one was the demise of the fairness doctrine. I mean, we didn't have Fox News and MSNBC back when we had the fairness doctrine.
Right.
So we got rid of that. And then Citizens United, that allowed, tons and tons of money to flood in. So a lot of times I'll have people say, I just don't understand how these MAGA people can believe some of the crazy stuff they believe. But if your total worldview and source of information is watching Fox News or OANN or, the MAGA media, that's all those people hear. They're not hearing. I mean, back in the day, when Walter Cronkite said, and that's the way it is, I mean, that's the way it was.
Right.
But, nowadays you can find a news outlet that'll, reinforce whatever your preconceived notion of the world was.
And do you think that some of us, like I'm of the theory, and when I was doing disinformation spaces on Twitter in 2022, in October 2022, as we were well into this war, I said, if you're watching MSNBC for your answers, you're just as guilty as others, because not to say that the information isn't there, but it's a silo. It's designed to give you the thing that you're looking to see. It doesn't necessarily give you action, and you're waiting for Rachel Maddow to write the headline that solves the problem. And it's not to blame anyone in particular on the network, or that the network exists. It's just that the siloing of it, the almost like, I think it was like childlike attachment to hope. That I tune in, and Nicole Wallace will talk to someone who gives me oh, look, I found a Republican who agrees with me. Yeah, well, if there's 5, what's the difference?
Right.
We want potency in there. And so I like Substack and these other, at least this chance of doing a little bit alternative way of approaching media, because we now hear those very experts we used to tune in on those networks directly coming to us. We have Glenn Kirshner is a great prosecutor, and Liz Troyer. They're coming and telling you directly how pardons work and how prosecution works, or Frank Figluzzi talking about FBI work, and the more people can get that direct relationship and bypass this corporate media that is really ready to cut them off once the money's interfered with. CBS is the great example of what happens when that goes wrong.
Yep.
And you mentioned fairness doctrine. We had this happen this week, right? With Stephen Colbert.
Yeah, it's and again, it's talk about weaponizing the Justice Department. Now we're weaponizing the Federal Communications Commission,
right?
And it's it serves a purpose for the other side. They want to quell dissent. I mean, it's an orchestrated effort. It's like the headset going after Mark Kelly. They wanted to make an example out of him to shut people up. They want to control the news so that you only hear what they want you to hear.
Let's dwell on that for a half a second, because Mark Kelly is a great candidate, but let's, just for the audience to hear it again. And you're not only a person with legal background, you have military legal background. Explain to our audience, just in case they missed it in the noise, what Mark Kelly and the other representatives and senators said, and how legal it was that they said it.
Yeah, well, they told the truth. I mean, there's nothing they said that was incorrect. And, as a lot of people chimed in, when all this was going on, from day one in the military, you're trained on the Geneva Conventions, and you're trained that you have a duty to follow the lawful orders of those appointed above you.
Right.
And the corollary to that is you have a duty not to obey the unlawful orders. So like Lieutenant Calley, when he ordered his troops to shoot the civilians, in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
they had a duty not to obey that order.
Right.
And I think there was a lot of concern here, particularly as for, I never thought I'd see the day where you had the threat of troops being deployed against American citizens.
Right.
So I think there was a lot of concern. I know a number of attorneys that were getting calls from service members, worried about, what do I do if I get the order to, do something I think is immoral or unethical or illegal. And so that's why Mark Kelly and the others put out the video, just reminding, that telling them the truth that
Right.
you have a duty, you have a legal duty not to obey an unlawful order. And there's nothing false or defamatory or
And that's where you were at with Admiral Stephen Haynes, yes? I mean, you could
right,
tell from his there will be no acquittals.
right. Yeah,
That was the line.
and again, yeah, I see a lot of parallels between what I went through back then and what we're going through now. And one thing I had people back then say, "Well, why did you stick around for so long?" I did the job for a little over 2 years. Why did you stay when you knew all this bad stuff was happening?
Mm-hmm.
And I did because I knew if I quit, they would find a yes man that would do exactly what they wanted. And I thought I could do, more good from the inside than from the outside. So I stayed for as long as, I felt that I could. And I like to think there's still folks in government that have that same attitude, that they don't like what's going on, but they feel like they're hanging in there to try to make the best of a bad situation. And then the other thing was that, at some point, you've got to quit. And that's what I did when it became very clear that, I was ordered to use evidence obtained by torture. It was time to quit. And I'm pleased to see, you saw in Minneapolis last week where I think a half a dozen prosecutors quit.
Right.
So I'm pleased to see that, there still are people, that have integrity. And
I do hope that in the administration, or in the gears of the executive branch and law enforcement and the DOJ, that there are people who are still able to do that just have not raised their head up, because we know there's a purging
yep.
going on. There's a loyalty test that's going through all of it, the Pentagon, etc. Have you had any either active duty or people within that sphere that come to you and said, "Hey, I've got pressure on"? Are you in that? Do you have connections like that?
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with, folks that are still in government or still in the military
Hmm.
that, you know, they're not happy about the situation they're in.
Right.
And I've known some people that just said, screw it, I'm done, and retired or quit. But there still are pockets of folks that, have a good heart and the right intentions that are, you know, trying to, again, I think it goes back to kind of like what I went through, that, I knew if I quit, they'd find somebody that would do what they wanted done.
Right.
And that seems to be the criteria now. If you want a position in the Trump administration, the only criteria is, will you do what Trump tells you to do? I mean,
I want to address one thing I like about when I watch your videos. And I hope we will get more of you on this platform where people get a direct access to your voice, plus your podcasting, is that you come from a strain in America, or a view in America, that is what I still idyllically think America was supposed to be. So when we have this idea that metropolitan New York or metropolitan California has one way, there's this other America. And I'm from Texas. By the way, I was born in Missouri. My dad's from Arkansas. My mom's from South Dakota. A lot of family from Oklahoma, Louisiana, etc. I know the same type of people, just in the middle.
yeah,
And you, I've always felt you speak their language. Um, what do we got to do to get more of that salt of the earth out there, or empower those people? What's your perspective on that? Because you
yeah,
still live in one of the best parts of the entire country, no less.
Yeah, no. I mean, for folks that have never been to Asheville, you really should come. I think a lot of folks still, when they think of Asheville, they think of Hurricane Helene, and we still
Yeah.
have a lot of work to do here to get back to normal. But it's still just probably one of the most beautiful places you'll ever see. Our mountains are just second to none, and great food, great craft beer, just a wonderful place to live. But it's a really interesting. Western North Carolina is a really interesting place. When I ran for Congress, Asheville, we call it the Blue Bubble.
Hmm. Sure.
Always referred to it as the Berkeley of the Blue Ridge.
It's like
Uh,
Austin is in Texas. So it's a red state, but
yeah,
Austin is very, very blue bubble.
yeah, and I've got several friends here in Asheville that moved here from Austin,
Right, right.
and for that reason, because it is. I mean, it's a very progressive, accepting. Just the motto here in Asheville is "Keep Asheville Weird."
Right. It's
And
what Austin's motto is, right?
yeah, but but if you go, I mean, from where I'm sitting, you can go 10 miles in any direction,
Hmm.
and it's deep red.
Right.
And um, and even the Democrats, who, if you get outside of the blue bubble, are blue dog Democrats. So,
Hmm.
like running for Congress here, if you're 15 degrees left of AOC, that is hugely popular in Asheville.
Hmm.
But if you get outside of it, then even the Democrats aren't, the ultra progressive, uh, type of Democrats. It's discouraging. I mean, when I was running, I early on talked about people voting against their interests, and the
Hmm.
experts I was paying said, "Oh, you got to stop saying that. You're implying people are stupid."
Well, thank you. So I want to get to the admonitions of you speaking clearly. It gets the brakes put on it. I like to approach it from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs aspect.
Yeah,
You and I both know that people in that red area just a little bit outside have a need system that's parallel to yours in so many
right.
ways, but something else is being fed to them.
Yeah.
What do we have to do to bridge that gap so that Maslow's is addressed from
Well,
your perspective?
I think we need to join the volunteer fire department
Okay. Right.
and go to church and play church league softball, because a lot of these folks have they literally believe that Democrats are demonic.
Hmm.
But when they get to know them, when it's like, that's one thing that was kind of, there weren't a lot of positives out of Hurricane Helene,
Sure.
but one positive was nobody asked, "Are you a Democrat or Republican?"
Right.
I mean, within days of the hurricane ending, we had, Franklin Graham's organization, Samaritan's Purse rolled in. We had Jose Andres from World Central Kitchen, and those two guys could not be further apart. But their organizations were just indispensable. And they never said, "Are you a Democrat or Republican?" It was neighbors helping neighbors, people from the outside coming in just to be helpful. And I think that's what we need for, folks to see that we're not your enemy, we're your neighbors. And
Hmm.
we've got more in common than we have apart. And you've got to give the other side credit. The oligarchs have used their money effectively to get the peasants to fight amongst themselves
Correct.
for the
Correct.
benefit of the oligarchs. So, we've got to talk to people. And I mean, I think some folks here are beginning to see, we've just had I forgot what the numbers are, but a lot of folks lost their health care with when the subsidies went away for the Affordable Care Act.
Hmm.
By this time next year, there will be about 60,000 people here in Western North Carolina will lose their Medicaid coverage. And I think as some of these folks start, I mean, when Trump was doing things to people that they don't like, they liked it. But when it's them or their grandmother or their kid that's
Hmm.
feeling the pain, it starts to sink in. I think we've got an opportunity to reconnect with some of those people. I mean, that's the argument I've been making here for, if a candidate here wants to win other than a MAGA candidate,
Hmm.
you've got to make this not a race between the red and blue. It's got to be a race between the rich and the rest.
Right.
And most folks here are the rest. They're not the rich. And, you know, the income gap, the wealth gap, everything's growing. I mean, the economy's great if you're a billionaire.
Right.
It's not great if you work at.
Since I'm in Kyiv, like actually some things are expensive here, even though it doesn't feel quite as bad
Right.
when I look at the numbers compared to America. But there are some, some tough realities in prices. What are the prices like where you're at for basic commodities that, everyone has to have? Eggs and bread and gasoline and
Yeah.
paying your way. What are
Yeah.
they like now?
It's a mixed bag. I think, the whole bag, it's more expensive than it was a year ago. There's some things like, if you recall right towards the end of the Biden administration, beginning of the Trump administration, because of bird flu, there was a spike in egg prices. So egg prices are not what they were, but that's offset in other areas. I can tell you today, I went to Lowe's Hardware and bought a pair of Carhartt pants that I bought a pair a month ago and I liked them. So I went back to get another and they're $5. They're 10% more this month than they were last month. And it's because they're made, if you look at the label, they're not made here in the US. So the tariffs, people are feeling the effects of the tariffs.
Right.
And this notion that, China's going to pay for it and it's going to be great for working class people are seeing that was, bullshit. And people are struggling. We've had a pretty cold winter and energy prices are up. Food prices are up and folks are really, a lot of folks, I can tell you my wife works or volunteers with an organization that distributes food. And, the lines are, longer now than they were a year ago.
Wow.
And I think that's going to, it's going to get worse, particularly as, like I said, the Republicans were smart and put off the implementation of the Medicaid cuts until after the election. But by this time next year, people are going to be feeling the pain.
One of our viewers, Lisa, says, did you say this time next year, approximately 600,000 people will lose their health care?
No, here in Western North Carolina, it'll be about 60,000.
60,000.
Yeah, statewide in North Carolina, I think it's about 650,000.
Wow.
And nationwide, you're looking at millions. And the vast majority, again, there's that perception of, somebody just sitting at home, eating lobster and, with their feet up and milking the system. And, there may be a case of that somewhere, but the vast majority of the folks who are going to feel the brunt of the pain are working class people. People that get up in the morning and go to work and their kids go to school and, they have to worry about, health care and rent and, all those things. Those are the people that are going to feel the pain. And that's where I think we've got an opportunity to say, look, the divide in this country between red and blue, the divides between the rich and the rest.
Right.
And it's time that the rest, and again, I'm not saying we ought to soak the rich, but they ought to be doing their fair share. I mean, it's like take, Social Security, 2032, we're going to have to start cutting Social Security benefits. The easy fix is lift the cap. Elon Musk pays a very, very, very minor part of his wealth is subject to FICA.
Right.
Where for everybody else, 7.75% of your paycheck, is going into FICA. So raise the cap and, Social Security solvent for the rest of our lifetime. But again, I think, the rich need to be doing their fair share and we've got to quit. And it always amazes me. I was reading something today where, I'm part of the big, beautiful bill. There's you can take an immediate.
The big, beautiful bill.
Yeah. You can take if you go out and buy a racehorse, there was a racehorse as a 12-year-old mare that had given birth years before to a very successful horse. And the mare was on the auction block and sold for $3.2 million. That thanks to the big, beautiful bill, you can immediately deduct from your income. But so for the rich, they have to have incentives. If you do something for the have-nots, then it's socialism. It just the system needs to be fair and get, it's again, we're the richest country in the world. And the fact that people go hungry and can't go to the doctor is just inexcusable.
I want to take you a little bit to the international level, but about Americans, not about what's happening abroad. We'll use the abroad categories like Greenland and insulting Europe, by themselves going and capturing Maduro. And how do you think that like people in North Carolina or common America, as we might see it, are in need of kind of a reality check of what happens when we keep letting this happen? For instance, UK today said, "You're not using our bases to attack Iran." What happens when America can't do that as a military man?
Well, there's a friend of mine here in Asheville who's retired from the diplomatic corps. We had that discussion over the weekend that, we spent decades building up relationships that have been mutually advantageous.
Mm-hmm.
And the damage that we've done is going to take decades to try to repair. I mean, why would anybody trust the U.S.? And particularly, like, well, I mean, to me, it's just inexcusable what's happening in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
one of my only triggers is that Trump's calling Putin again. I can handle a lot of things. Like, literally, by the way, the air raid has just ended, so at least the ballistic warning is over for now.
All right.
But there's a lot of those things we here collectively have just got used to as it's another day of. But the Trump's on the phone with Putin again. Just can't deal with it. It's a trigger at this point. I mean, I will turn that trigger off in order to survive. But I don't know what it feels like in common America at that point. I know what it feels like in applied America or applied people who pay attention to the details in some way.
But again, we're talking before about, there's that family out in a rural county that's struggling to pay the rent and worried about can their kid go to, it's, that's not cracking their top 10 list.
Right.
The folks that are paying attention, particularly like, I hang out with a bunch of retired military folks.
Right.
And we talk about, we spent our entire careers, doing chemical warfare training and sitting alert and in missile silos because of Russia.
Right.
And all of a sudden, this notion that Canada's our enemy and Russia's our friend is just, unfathomable. And, we're going to see, like, I'm out, with the UK saying we can't launch from there if we're going to war with Iran. I mean, I don't blame other countries. I mean, why would you coddle the U.S. when the U.S. is no longer a reliable ally?
Right.
And
I wrote a report. About a month ago after Germany said, and I should say it was an official in Germany. It wasn't the country itself saying this. Said, well, we can always say, annex it to the bases. And it was in relationship to, I don't know if it was the Greenland venture, if you would call it that. But there was a lot of chatter on that, Vance coming into Vance had just visited as well in Europe. And just this bravado that walked in and says, well, we don't like your freedom of speech laws, and we don't like this, and we don't like that. And one of the officials there said, well, the base you seem to like, maybe we won't let you use it. So I started calculating that. I spent about a week just going, how many bases, how many personnel, what happens when you don't have that anymore? And I went, well, there goes superpower. That's the end of superpower right there.
Yeah. It is. I mean, again, we spent decades and decades. I mean, I feel bad for the greatest generation that they were, followed up by the most stupid generation.
Right.
Because their sacrifices, I mean, that's why my dad was 100% disabled veteran of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And, he was the anti-fascist.
Amen.
And I think,
my grandfather was an Antifa as well, artillery guy.
Yeah. I mean, the notion that all of a sudden all the, our friends are our enemies, our enemies are our friends. is just, as I said, unfathomable. But that's where we are, and I'm hoping that this is going to wear off at some point, and we'll
Mhm.
swing back towards normalcy. But
Do you think? I think of it. I could equate it to chewing gum, or if you've ever had bad brisket that lost its flavor before you started eating it. Do you think there's something about MAGA versus, because you're a former Republican, I believe, yeah? Yeah.
no, I've
Yeah.
always been always
Oh, you just straightforward Democrat.
always have been. I'm an
Yeah.
here in North Carolina. We're referred to as unaffiliated, or
Okay,
most
fair.
places called independents.
Yeah, I'm from Texas. That's what we have. We're basically neither party.
Right.
And you might be a little bit left in an independent, you might be a little right in an independent, or this like rigid centrist. But
Right.
um,
That's been one of the things too here that I mean, not just in North Carolina, but nationwide. I mean, in North Carolina, the unaffiliated independent voters are 42%
mhm,
of the registered voters. Republicans are about 30%, and Democrats
mhm,
are about 25%. So you've just seen a huge growth in independent, unaffiliated voters, and primarily people that are just sick and tired of party politics,
right,
and they don't like either party.
right.
But
Well, that's what. So the reason why I thought I had that category in my head is the coffee party. If you remember,
yeah,
was one of
yep,
the answers right there, which is an area that you can meet as a Democrat. You can meet Republicans who want to be reasonable.
right,
And I know I've actually run into MAGA Republicans. They were older though, 65 to 75, and they had certain views. And this is also not current MAGA. This was 2018, 2017, 2018. And I could talk to that side of them. I could
right,
use basically, I'm going to go back to Maslow's, appeal for patriotism, appeal for entrepreneurial spirit, appeal for, rugged individualism, um, cooperative volunteer work within, like you mentioned, firefighters. One of them was, in fact, a firefighter who intervened with a Proud Boy trying to get in my face. I said, hey, wait, this guy's a good guy, didn't talk to him reasonably.
yeah,
And he clearly voted. He told me flat out he voted for Trump. Um, but I think we have to build that up. And part of my question about the chewing gum that loses its flavor is that I believe that the only thing that Republicans have run on since, post Reagan, so I think a little bit in Reagan era before, but definitely post Reagan with Rush Limbaugh, was the grievance peddling nonstop
yeah,
over and over again, was the only thing they could do, is grievance peddle. And the opposite side of that argument is boring on the radio. There is no way that Air America and those different shows get very far by doing grievance peddling from a different point of view. Whether you say left or right is immaterial, but it doesn't ring as well because they want to talk about culture and quality poetry and books and things that are happening in life. And there's this other side that, no, you're getting fucked by the government. You're getting fucked by liberals. They're taking your Christmas away. And it's grievance peddling. And do
yeah.
you think that there are people around you who might be a little bit to the right in red that are worn out on that?
Yeah, I think some are. I mean, I think you know, kitchen table issues are the
Mhm.
primary motivator for most folks, and I think that I think folks are more worried about putting food on the table than which bathroom somebody goes in to take a peek.
Right, right.
But the other side, again, they've been very effective at picking those cultural issues
Mhm.
and using that as leverage, to enrich themselves, get us fighting amongst ourselves while they pick our pockets. And,
Right.
I think there are two categories of people. I think they're the irredeemable. I mean, there are some that are just so, I mean, it is a cult.
Yes, it is.
You can show them stuff with their own eyes and play it for their own ears, and they still, don't believe it. And
Correct.
I think you're just wasting your time.
Right.
trying to
Leave
convert.
that to the experts like Steve Hassan, the guys who have the mathematics to get under that hood. But the other ones, I think we can talk to them. And like Patty has a great question in the space, I think gets to that. We're currently watching defense contractors losing contracts. Do you believe this is going to hurt our ability to produce new advanced technology for our own defenses as well? And let me just use that same question. I wrote a piece, 53 billion that are being wasted in the appropriations for Ukraine. They were actually all in districts like Lance Gooden and Mesquite, Texas, who Mesquite, Texas is very red, and they have an artillery factory that's not firing on all cylinders when we have a fucking war.
Yep.
So on a mere economic level, it would be easy for me to have a good candidate go out and say, why is this guy not putting you to work? We have a factory right there, and we're underdeveloping.
Right.
So, Patty, I think that it kind of answers a little bit of your question. What do you think about that?
Yeah. One of the things when I was running, one of the things I was running on was there's just our whole fiscal approach in this country is just insane.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the defense, Trump wants to increase the defense budget to $1.5 trillion. And as you know, for year after year after year, there's always been this notion that if you don't support increasing the defense budget, then you hate America. You hate the troops. But most of the defense budget, I mean, we still have troops. And I think the number was 30% of junior enlisted families qualify for food assistance. So
right.
increasing the defense budget does very little for the troops. It does a lot for big defense contractors like Palantir. So, increasing and again, year after year we hear, well, we got to increase our defense budget to keep up with Russia and China. Well, as you know, we spend more on defense than the next 10 countries behind us combined. So for decades, we have outspent Russia and China, by tenfold. So you think they would be the ones that've got to increase their spending to catch up with us. But, it's always we've got to catch up to them. And it's because the whole fiscal approach here is, particularly in the military, the fiscal year is from September, September 30th is the end of the fiscal year. So October 1st, the year ends on September 30th. And if you've ever been in the government or the military, around September 1st, there's this mad dash to spend every penny in your budget. Because if you don't spend it all this year, then you obviously don't need that much next year.
Right.
So there's no incentive to be efficient in spending money. And too much of it goes to, every year the Pentagon is forced to buy billions of dollars of crap that they never asked for, don't want, don't need, but there's a plant in somebody's district that makes that widget. So whether you want it or not, you're going to buy $1 billion of widgets. So I would love
the
to see
thoughtlessness of it. Yeah, the thoughtlessness of it really sticks out. And there was a briefing we had here in Kyiv today about the energy devastation that's going on a regular basis. And I asked Alexander, who's an expert in this field, let me ask you about, are there any countries that are coming to us here in Kyiv and saying, hey, like, we need to know what you do to keep your electricity up, because I come from Texas. A dog can piss in the backyard and the whole thing goes down, and there's no drones and there's no missiles. It's just Greg Abbott, And one of the things Alexander said was, we have a need for redundancy. So we know that when we bring in a high power generation system, we need to have the next one just like it being prepared, because that one's going to be destroyed possibly. And he's not just using one type of component. He's talking about all the components have to keep being produced so that we have it ready. He goes, but however, in America and other places, they're just looking to have one, and then it just kind of goes on to budgets for ephemeral reasons, because there's not a sense of urgency or a war footing for those power systems. And I think that there's a little bit of a secret in that Americans need to think about, with especially like power grid failures in Texas as an example,
Right.
that they can put the money back in their pocket while they're still billing you higher than ever. And I use a different example that's not in the electric market. My T-Mobile bill that I still have to keep in order to have functional calls to America is $95 to have that. I think it's called the Magenta plan. And certainly, if I was in America and I could probably get down to a little bit less on some things, I'm still paying a lot of money. But here, I can arm both of my phones with Ukrainian SIMs for about $750 each.
Yeah.
With 100 gigabytes of data and all the social media is already wired in. It doesn't charge me extra to use X or Facebook. It's somehow I have a contract for that. But the overhead for both of those is, 15% my U.S. bill. So there's a whole lot of area of the infrastructure of America that's both vulnerable and not profitable to anyone but, like you said, the haves.
Right. Yeah. Hey, and your power grid example is not unique to Texas. We just had a squirrel knock
Thank
out
you.
power for most of Asheville last week.
Wow.
One squirrel managed to take down the grid. But yeah, I mean, again, I mentioned the defense budget and what a waste it is. I mean, healthcare.
Mhm.
We spend more
Mhm.
money than any country in the world on healthcare. We're not the healthiest, and we have millions of people that have no coverage
Mhm.
because it's not about patient care; it's about profits.
Right.
And that's what I see happening. I'm really concerned. When I ran briefly for Congress this year or last year now, and each member of Congress can serve on 2 committees, and my goal was to be on the Natural Resources Committee
Mhm.
because our economy here is based on tourism, and that tourism is based on our national parks and our national forests that have
Mhm.
been underfunded for decades. And the other was on the Veterans Affairs Committee because, like I said, our VA hospital is ranked number 2 in the country, and firing employees and cutting budgets is not helpful. But I see an effort to do that. I think, there's an effort to privatize the VA.
Mhm.
And by doing that, they want to profitize it. They see an opportunity to, uh, you know, get rid of the VA medical centers and push veterans out into the healthcare system where the oligarchs who own, HCA and the other big healthcare providers then can skim a profit off of it.
Right.
But there are just too many areas here in this country, whether it's defense or healthcare, education, prisons, where it's all driven by folks at the top making more profits. And I keep hoping
And
one day.
what do you think in the party itself? In the Democratic Party, let me stick to that. In the party itself, what do you think is happening with their? I call it the inner monarchy, that keeps them from understanding that they have not been offering solutions to these obvious needs. They give lip service to healthcare when they do debates and when they're up on the podium against a Republican. But what is the ground game? Because I don't see it. People I know who have been running for office in other parts of the country get thrown off even the conversation threads. If they bring up anything that's outside of some inner policy sphere. What's your read on that with the party?
Yeah, and I'm glad I heard.
Fresh read, by the way.
Yeah, I heard you mention you're going to have Fred Wellman on. I'm glad you are. Fred's running in Missouri for Congress, and
Mhm.
we need people like that. And you mentioned Graham Palantir up in.
Yeah.
But again, I mean he's a good example. The party. I think a lot of folks are just tired of the party establishment running, picking the candidates for them.
Right.
And he's a good example. The Democratic Party, he was not the person they wanted. So they got the governor. I forgot what her age is, but, it's
Mhm.
past the point where she ought to be running for the Senate. And you saw it happen in New York City, where
Mhm.
Mamdani was, started out with like a 1% chance of winning, and Andrew Cuomo was the party establishment candidate that
Right. Right.
all the money went behind. And so you know, I'm somewhat optimistic that the grassroots of the parties are starting to stand up to the money and the establishment.
Mhm.
Um, and I think if we can do that, because right now I mean, I can tell you, you see it happen often where the rich folks they're playing both sides.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you the races going on here now. They're folks that are max donors to both the Republicans and the Democrats because
Right.
whichever side wins, they want to make sure that they own a piece of the folks that make the rules.
The thing I liked about Graham Plattner, and I didn't know much about him,
Yeah.
was there was it was a video where he was having a discussion with people, and he says, your neighbor just got ripped off, and I know you don't agree with their politics, and I know you don't agree with the way they voted, but they got ripped off. And if you don't have some sympathy for that, you need to look at yourself for a moment, because it would be no different if someone walked in and robbed them, right? Would you feel? And he's hitting a reality check that I know I have. I have a certain level of cynicism that's really been baked in over the last, I don't know, 10 years. Um, and he spoke to a part that I think we have to look at ourselves. So, what do you think the rest of the candidates who are running, either potentially now or even the next cycle after this, need to start internalizing to amplify that type of message?
Yeah, I think they have to again focus on those kitchen table issues. Don't get sucked into the culture war.
Hmm.
I mean, it's like I think it was Maine. Was it? Yeah, I think it was Maine where Trump was going to withhold funding. And it was over
Hmm.
a transgender athlete, which there's a grand total of one in that state. Um,
Right.
but they can take that one person and use it to motivate tens of thousands to vote against their own interests. So I think Democratic candidates, number one, have to be more assertive,
Hmm.
fight harder. I mean, I think folks want somebody they feel like is going to go and fight for them. And
Right.
if the word that comes to mind when they think of your party is weak,
Hmm.
uh, you're not winning. So I think we need folks that has some gumption, and they need to focus on the issues that matter to everyday people, and not get bogged down in all the minutia of the culture stuff, and just stay on message and keep hammering the other side for the hypocrisy. Um, it's again, whatever the Republicans are griping about the Democrats doing, I can guarantee you that's what the Republicans are doing.
Right. Right.
So we need to be hammering them and holding them accountable for the stuff that for too long we didn't have we let them define who we were,
Right.
and we've got to.
True. Yeah, and Stephen Colbert said this one time. He says, if you can box me into the descriptors that you control, then there's really no need for a conversation, because I'm already, preordained in those ways. So why talk to me?
Yep.
And I actually changed that a little bit of last couple of years, where I would just stop the conversation. I said, okay, before we go any further, yeah, I don't accept your framing of that. So you're going to have to start again, please.
Yeah.
What? You're going to have to start again. I don't agree with the framing. You have facts there, and I hear your
Right.
facts, but the framing is off. Please, could you say that again, please?
Yeah.
And I've seen a few other like these kind of debate style things that are happening on Jubilee on YouTube. I'm sure they're always effective for every conversation in the world, but when someone basically does the same thing, saying, "I don't adopt your narrative," when you threw it on the table at me. And I think the more we can do that with each other, where we step back and know ourselves, even what do we stand for as people, or are we also flailing through the mess? So I think that's where we got to go. Let me say it this way one more time, and I want to throw it back to you, and then we'll wrap and welcome our friends to another space next time, or another Substack. Um, a person I know that was very, very right wing for a few years, that kind of turned on them, said to me that one of the things that people who try to confront it, in meaning the extreme, is that you don't know our language. You don't speak the language we speak when we're talking to each other. We've really developed a codified system of in group, out group. And Chris, he was saying to me, Chris, you know about in group, out group, but you're very much on the out group when you're talking to people on this particular group that you survey, like the Proud
Right.
Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters. You don't speak their language. You understand that, right? Yeah, I understand that. Okay, well, how do you disarm yourself from reinventing all the things they believe about you when everything that comes out of your mouth is the same condemnation.
Right.
You're just an idiot. You're just whatever the different descriptors are. So what do we have to do as people who get it, grok it, and to start changing how we talk
Yeah.
amongst our coworkers, our family, even? Thanksgiving will eventually come around, I think. What are some habits you think we could do?
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, Democrats for too long were great on writing 50-page position papers that nobody read. And Republicans wrote 3-word bumper stickers that everybody remembered. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think, I think you're exactly right that we need to talk to the people and not down to them
Hmm.
about the thing. We need to sit down with them and say, hey, look, what's important to you and your family? And
Hmm.
we just did a very, very poor job of messaging. I can tell you, when I ran, a lot of folks, on the right said, "Oh, I hate Obamacare. We got to get rid of Obamacare." And I would say, "Well, what do you think about not kicking people off for pre-existing conditions?" Well, yeah, I like that. What do you
Right.
think about letting your kids stay on until they're 26 so they get out of school and they get established? Yeah, that's a good idea. You could go through all the different points in
All the stuff in the
affordable.
ACA, they liked it until he put the
Yeah,
name
yeah. It
Obamacare.
was the label that was on it. So often we shoot ourselves defund the police. Whoever came up with that term was an idiot. I mean,
Right.
I agreed with the concept. I think we need to refocus policing because we're giving them, responsibilities that really weren't a law enforcement function, particularly like with mental health and drug addiction and that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But to say we're going to defund the police just was a slam dunk for the other side. So we've got to be more effective in messaging. We've got to talk the way that people talk in the real world, not in academia. And the real challenge, I think, like I know, at least looking here in Western North Carolina, is how do you talk to those people? Like,
Hmm.
when I ran in 2020 was during COVID, and I think Democrats did the right thing. We didn't put people at risk by having, big mass events and
Hmm.
exposing people. And I had never used Zoom until COVID
Mm.
hit. And then, my whole campaign was spent on Zoom, but we still have 85,000 homes in this district that don't have broadband. So you
Right.
can't you can't communicate with people out in Graham County on broadband. So, we've got to get, those little local newspapers, those little local AM radio stations, those billboards. We've got to find ways to penetrate those communities that are kind of news deserts and let them know, what the other side is doing to them and what we would like to do for them. And I think,
Yeah, when I had my conversation with Brian Karem a couple of weeks ago about the attack on the press, we talked about news deserts in areas where basically a certain amount of information is pumped in from corporate, like radio, would be Cumulus Network and Cox Communications, and especially like a detached version of like NPR speaking to your local community. I mean, it's not to slam NPR, but can they be responsive to your community? No, because they don't know your community. It's a generic overall umbrella of conversation, and if you don't have that in the neighborhood, you're screwed. And I'll use the example of my former representative, Gene Green, who I had some issues with about some of his politics. But a guy named Roy Morales ran against him, and I got this ad in that says, "Gene Green doesn't know your district." And I went, "Okay, Ben, you can hit me with a ton of things about Gene Green, but what you can't hit me on is that he doesn't know his district." And why did I say that? Because I knew that he went to Kiwanis Club and the veterans, the VA locations and even Shell Oil. He would go to all sorts of places. He had foot turf skills that are next level. Really, really had that. And I could disagree with him on things, but he called me back. You know, one of the
yep,
few representatives who actually take the time to call. But Chris, this is Gene. I got your email, and I'm sorry I've been busy. And he would go down the list of whatever was on there, and he had it down. And so I told Roy Morales, I said, Roy, what was the number one employer in District 29 through 1980? Well, come on. Starts with Armco Steel. He didn't know about it. He
Yeah.
had no idea what was happening. And I said, okay, so what happens when when Lyondell Petrochemical has to change to something else? You don't know our damn district. And I think that this is an area when people are running for office, we need to give them those empowerment skills to say, do you know your district? Do you know how to get on the ground and learn what's happening? And you mentioned COVID. That's what made me think about it.
Yeah.
Because I know that when I was listening to one of these broadcasts with you, that was an issue. You couldn't go out and do that grassroots turf building that is
Yeah.
so vital. Yeah.
Yeah. And in a lot of districts, that's the only way you're going to do it. You've got to go to where they are and meet them where they
Right.
are and
Even
listen
if they're
to.
angry at you.
Yeah. But they appreciate that you show up.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you showed up. You were so patient while we worked out the technical, and everyone that was on me because I sent it to another Mo Davis account that it was, I think it may be an old county head instead of Colonel Mo. So follow his account now if you don't mind. Got 20 of you here, and there will be people saying on the restack here. But follow his account, and I hope you'll come back because I think that with Fred and Rick Wilson and
Yep.
my friend Phil Ayer will be joining us shortly. And
Great.
Phil's another veteran who has
Yep.
experience at a certain level that is being dismissed for a person I've never heard of, whose knowledge about the big picture I don't know, and the party likes that other person probably.
Yep.
But we hope you'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. It's been fun talking with you, and man, good luck over there. I mean, there are a lot of us over here that haven't forgotten about Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, it's like once it passes midnight, it'll be 1411 in days of war for me, and add 46 of that for everyone else for the full scale. And actually, it's 12 years ago, on the 18th into the 19th, that Yanukovych opened fire and killed 107 Ukrainians in order to basically have a trade deal with Russia. That wound up putting him on a plane and sending him to Moscow. He resigned, and
Yeah.
then Rada basically said, "You're done," and it was over. But he killed 107 people on the way out. And I say that because when I talk to our viewers, often I say, do the math of what that proportionality is for Americans. We already have had, besides two people killed with Renee Good and Alex Preddy, there are others you didn't name, or we don't get to see their names in the news that were killed. And what's the proportion? I mean, that's 1,000 people nearly to do the proportions. And I hope that we don't get there. But I think that my experience here has really given me a new sense of the urgency in America to get it together.
Yeah. Well, there's some of us trying. We're gonna, don't
I
give up.
appreciate you. I can't give up on you. It's just not the wiring. And I appreciate you for joining. So we'll see you again soon. Thank you, my
Thanks,
brother.
Chris. Take care.
See you soon. All right. And so again, to everybody, please make sure you following Colonel Mo's account, and we'll make sure that there's some good content for him up here. And where's your podcast? I know you have a podcast still. Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Well,
doing
I've
some-
kind of stepped away from it. I think David's still doing. It's called Muck You. It was
Yeah.
it was a spinoff from the American Muckrakers. And
Yeah.
we had some great guests. Adam Kinzinger, Rick Wilson, you mentioned. We had Elon's dad on.
Yeah.
So we've had some really interesting folks on.
Well, I see some people here saying thank you so much, and thank you, Colonel Mo. There's a bunch of folks in here saying that in the chat space, and we will definitely follow up because this midterm season is chaotic, and we're going to have to stick together. We're going to have to keep seeing what the developments are, and every week it's a whole nother cognitive warfare game in play. So thank you for joining us.
Right.
We'll see you soon, brother.
Take care.
And to everyone else, we will see you soon. Thank you. And as you know how we do it here, Slava Ukraini, Heroim Slava i Pizdets Rossiyskiy Federacji. And by the way, God bless America and all of you great Americans who are still fighting and still trying.